Howdy do, folks. So I thought it was time to break open a new section of Gameology, and since it's around the time of year when I do my content for the spooky season, I thought we'd go ahead and knock out the survival horror genre. So for the next several videos, I'm going to be giving my thoughts and opinions on what I think constitutes good game design in the survival horror genre. As always, we are going to start with defining the genre, what exactly is the survival horror game, and talk about a hard to nail down definition. It seems like every time a new horror game comes out, the press labels it as survival horror, as if that's just a catch-all term for any horror game. And then you have a very vocal section of the gaming public who comes out and says that it's not a survival horror game, and then they'll do these great big elaborate video game essays. And then they'll just talk about why it's not a survival horror game. It's just one of the big ongoing arguments in the gaming community. And as I always say, everything I say in these videos is just my own biased perspective, my own opinions. So I'm not going to pretend like what I'm presenting here is fact either. These are just my own ideas of what makes something a survival horror game. And what I think makes something a survival horror game really comes down to three components of the gameplay that sort of intermingle with each other to create that secret sauce that makes something a survival horror game. So the first thing is probably the most obvious thing. The game has to try to scare you. Honestly, I've always found the moniker of survival horror to be a little silly, because when you think about it, the goal of any video game is just to survive. So calling it survival horror just seems a little silly. But, obviously if you want something to be a survival horror game, you have to have that horror aspect of it. So if the game isn't trying to scare you, it's obviously not a survival horror game, so you need to have that. The other thing that you need to have is resource management. Now, a lot of games, they do have some degree of resource management, whether it be your ammo count in an FPS game, how many power-ups you have on a platformer, stuff like that. But it's a bit different in a survival horror game. The resources are a big part of the game because in a good survival horror game, resources are scarce. You only have so much ammo, you only have so much healing items. There are certain items that can really help you out in the way through the game, but you also want to be careful of how you use them because there's only so much of them. And yeah, so you need to have that resource management, and it has to be done in a very specific way, which we are going to talk about later. And the last thing, and I need you guys to stay with me on this one because I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, there has to be some combat. Now, there's always going to be this group of people who probably don't play a lot of horror games to begin with, who are going to tell you that a horror game is scarier if you can't defend yourself. However, that's an idea that I feel is good in theory, but not necessarily in practice. Now, I played Slender, I played Outlast, I played Amnesia, the famous games that, sort of promoted this idea. And those experiences I never found quite as scary as an experience in, something like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or Dead Space. And the reason for that is, while the game still has the horror aspect of it, it doesn't have the combat aspects or the resource management aspect. In most of these games, the enemies can kill you in one hit, so, obviously, health items don't really matter at that point, and since you can't attack them, stuff like ammo, that also doesn't matter. So right away, the gameplay has already become much shallower than it otherwise would be. And in addition to that, when you encounter an enemy, your only recourse is really to just run away. Now, a lot of people say, therefore it's scarier. You're running in fear. Not necessarily. I'm not running away because I'm scared of these creatures, these monsters, whatever is trying to kill me. I'm scared. No, I'm not scared. I'm running away because that's the only choice I have. So, yeah, I feel like combat needs to be in a survival horror game. And I have a really good example of what I'm talking about here. As I said, these components individually are not what makes something a survival horror game. A lot of games have these different components individually, and they end up not working out as a horror game. For example, games that are just pure horror. You can't defend yourself. There's no resource management. They're just horror games and not survival horror games. There are plenty of games that focus on combat, maybe with a little bit of resource management. Those aren't necessarily survival horror games. Those are just pure action games. It's when these three components come together that something becomes a survival horror game. And I have the perfect example to demonstrate them all working together. This is a clip from the Resident Evil 2 remake, and it's when you encounter Mr. X for the first time. Now, Mr. X is basically the boogeyman of the game. He's this omnipresent force of nature that is constantly harassing you throughout the game. And no matter what you do, odds are you won't be able to shake him, barring a few situations in the game where he's just not around for whatever reason. Watch how this first encounter goes down with him.
Jesus Christ!
Okay, so let's look at our three elements and how they're all at play in this scene. So obviously it's scaring you because, you know, like this is the first time you've seen Mr. X in the game. Prior to this, I think you spot him on a security camera and you see him, and that alone puts you on edge because you know he's somewhere in the police station and you are just waiting with bated breath for when he comes out. And this is where you first encounter him, you know, face to face. And what's interesting about this component, this moment, is that it isn't a cutscene. It happens within the gameplay. Now, why is that important? Well, because of that, when this happens, it's where you see the other aspects of the gameplay at play. So the resource management and the combat. So because this is still a gameplay encounter, you have the option to pull the guns out and try to shoot Mr. X. Now, I think most people, after seeing him pick up the helicopter and throw it away like a softball, they would probably clue into the fact that Mr. X isn't an enemy that they're going to be able to defeat with the weapons they have on hand. So most people's inclination is going to be to run away. However, I'm sure there are also some people, probably people who aren't too familiar with horror games, like if Resident Evil 2 Remake was their first horror game, who will see Mr. X there and their first instinct is to pull out the guns and start shooting. So the fact that you have a choice there is also important because that means you can make a right and wrong choice. Obviously, the right thing to do here is run away because obviously you cannot defeat this thing. You are not going to beat Mr. X straight up. So, but if you do try right off the bat, then you just made a mistake. And how are you punished for that mistake? You just wasted resources, you wasted ammo, and if you let him get close to you and land a few hits, you just wasted health items too. This is how you know something has crossed the line between being a horror game, a survival game, or just a straight action game, and become a straight survival horror game, where all these three aspects come together to create a very specific experience. So to me, that's what constitutes survival horror. Now, there is, and for the next several videos, I am going to be going into greater detail on the individual aspects and all the different ways they can intermingle with each other. But there is one aspect that I'm sure classic fans of the survival horror genre want me to bring up, and that is fixed camera angles and tank controls. There is a very vocal group of fans of the genre who insist that a game is not a survival horror game unless it has the fixed camera angles and the tank controls. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but I feel this is completely false. And next time when we go into our Gameolgy series, I'm going to tell you exactly why. I'll see you guys then.